In what seems to be becoming our tradition of visiting South Africa and hiring a vehicle and then ending up doing a review on it, this is now the third time doing a South Africa special review, this time around of course for the facelifted Toyota Starlet, what you could in effect call a 6th generation Starlet, even though some Toyota aficionados might not quite like that because of course this one shares its underpinnings with the Suzuki Baleno, which is an interesting rival for it, and actually it compares quite well because the Suzuki is actually cheaper, or at least it was when new, with a slightly better level of kit for the price. Curiously though, even though it was initially cheaper, the Suzuki seems, at least when I checked Auto Trader in South Africa, to hold more of its value when it does come to selling it on. So interesting, the Toyota is more expensive, but it loses a little bit more money. Now this particular car of course follows on from last time, the Nissan Magnite, which we had, and then the time before that the Toyota Corolla Quest, but this one has a distinctly more super affordable level to its kit, to its finish, to its price point even. And when these first came out in around 2022, in particular in this facelifted form, there were 3 primary versions. These the Xi, the XS, and the XR. Now this particular version which we had was the XS, so the middle of the range, and as you can tell it was the automatic version in particular which we hired. The automatic does add to the price, so for reference when these were new you were looking at the Xi, which was, as far as I can tell, only available in manual form anyway, which was 226,000 Rand. Then the XS is available in manual for 239,000, and then this manual version would have been 261,000, and then the top of the tree, the XR, is 295,000, with the automatic version pushing it just over 300 to 313. On the used market, if you do want to go down that route though, as recently as a couple of weeks ago here in 2024, as far as I could tell, it looks to be entering the market at around 160,000 Rand for the Toyota, but for the Suzuki, as I alluded to earlier on, more like 180,000. And interestingly, there are not as many of the Suzukis on that used market. Now on the one hand, that could be a good thing. It could mean that people who buy them just keep them instead of selling them, which is always a good sign. But on the other hand, Suzuki doesn't have as much of a dealer presence in South Africa as Toyota does. So with less vehicles sold, that of course could be part of the deal as well. So ultimately, between those two cars at the very least, not counting stuff like your Volkswagen Polos and various other cars, you do really need to decide on if you want the slight price undercut, or at least when new, the price undercut of the Suzuki with a slightly better level of kit, but with less dealers and potentially less after sales and servicing support, or at least you'd have to drive further to do it. Now, as last time, and I believe the time before if I recall correctly, my girlfriend had a few points, both positive and negative. She had one primary positive thing which I definitely share, and to me it was probably the highlight about the entire experience with this car. We had it for a week, so it's a decent amount of time for a review, and the highlight for both of us was definitely the fuel use. It was very, very good. Now this car is actually marketed at a 5.1 litres per 100 kilometres highway economy, which is very good. And in practice, what that meant for us, because a lot of that time was spent at highway speeds, was we did roughly 400 kilometers over the course of the week, and that cost us about 600 Rand to refill the tank, because obviously being a hire car, it's a full to full policy, so we already started out with that full tank. And incidentally, the tank on this car is not all that big. It's only a 37 litre tank anyway, so to do that kind of mileage, or that kind of kilometers in this case, and to only cost 600 Rand to recoup that 400 kilometers, that's pretty impressive. I'm not going to go ahead and say that it's necessarily the best thing around, but I think for this price point, again for in some cases less than 230,000 when brand new, that's pretty damn good fuel economy. Now, as I said earlier on, this particular version was the XS. Now, both the base model Xi and the XS come with double DIN audio, CD, Bluetooth, USB, aux cable, of course, 6-speaker surround, so a lot of that is carried over. The real difference that you'll notice in terms of interior kit is with the XR, that top-of-the-range model, which also has Android and Apple CarPlay with a number of functionalities as well. Also, I believe a slightly larger screen, a touchscreen, of course. The interior is about as basic and as simple and as straightforward as you'd expect. Again, you'll see plenty of the interior showcased here in the video. It's pretty much just a case of what you'd expect from Toyota. Everything which needs to be there is there, and nothing that you don't really need. The car itself, as you would assume, is very compact, super easy to park. It doesn't feel overly narrow though, which of course is always a benefit, and not like a Japanese market K car, for example, where they tend to be fairly tall but not overly wide because of the restrictions of the city. In the case of this car, it has a decent width, even for a larger driver, with a passenger next to you as well. Rear passenger room is pretty good. Again, if I recall, I believe slightly more legroom on this car. Some have criticised the luggage room though. The boot definitely does look very small when you open it up. It's actually fairly deep. You could probably just about fit 2 or 3 decent sized travel bags if you really squeeze them in there. But if you're looking for any kind of oversized luggage, forget it, it's not going to fit in there, at least not with putting the back seats down instead, which you would have to do. In terms of overall space, I would say for a car in this segment, for its price, for this kind of super economy city car segment, it's pretty good on space actually. It uses the proportions of the car to its merit. Now in terms of the engine and in terms of performance, of course there is a slight difference between the auto and the manual. The manuals have a 5-speed, the auto is a 4-speed, and just like the Nissan Magnite, just like the Corolla Quest, and what I would assume many other cars of this type, if it's not a CVT, it certainly feels like one. It has a very CVT kind of delivery. One of the downsides which we noticed was the transmission is quite loud on this car. Even when it's not in overdrive, which it does have, a very Japanese thing to have on an automatic, it does make quite a bit of transmission noise, going up or downhill in some cases. And for all of that noise, it's not necessarily the quickest thing around in terms of performance. You're not expecting it to be a powerhouse, but still, you want enough performance to get up and go. I hear mixed things on this, and of course one of the downsides of having a hire car is you never know how other people have treated it and driven it. And one of the issues which I could feel in this car, and again Kiasha corroborated this, especially on her side, on the left of the car, was that it felt like a wheel bearing needed doing. The front left wheel definitely had a bit of wobble around the, say, 40-50 km/h mark, which felt like it needed some attention. I don't want to focus on that too much though, because obviously that's a specific thing with this car and not a general thing with the Starlet, so it wouldn't be fair to compare that to all of them. It is something to note with this one in terms of hampering my experience just a little bit. It's not like it's something which ruined the whole experience by any means. In terms of the engine though, it's a 1.5 litre, of course petrol as you'd expect, 77 kilowatts in terms of power, 138 newtons, so pretty decent, a slight increase over the previous car. Incidentally, that's 9 kilowatts more and 8 newton meters of torque more, so not a bad improvement. As I said, 5-speed manual or that 4-speed auto. Interestingly, and this really is a prime example of where modern technology has advanced so much compared to back in the day. In the 1980s, 90s, of course before, an automatic would have been inferior in most ways. Now though, this car is not only quicker with the automatic, it's also more fuel efficient. If you compare it, it's 5.1 litres, as I said, per 100 kilometre, compared to the manual, which is 5.4. So it's not a massive difference. It's not like it's going to break the bank for most people, but it is curious to see just how far technology has come with stuff like automatic gearboxes. Now the weight on this one, as you'd assume, is pretty low. It weighs less than a ton, 975 kilos, and you can definitely feel that through corners. It's got excellent handling. You can really chuck it around. I do personally find that some smaller vehicles, and this seems to be a fairly consistent thing with the ones that I hire in South Africa, these small, light front-wheel drive cars do feel, at least to my taste, a little bit squirrely on the freeway. They're a little bit loose, a little floaty over the front end, and it's kind of a front-wheel drive thing, especially when it's not a performance car, so you don't have, uprated suspension and various other things helping you out with narrow tyres, etc. So that's something which I think is more of a me issue, because most people don't seem bothered by that, and I guess it's because I'm used to typically driving either performance cars with four-wheel drive, wider wheels, etc. Or on the other hand, as many who watch my reviews will have seen, most of the cars that I talk about do tend to be quite big, heavy, powerful cars, luxury sector or otherwise. So of course in comparison to those, these are going to feel a little bit twitchy, and it wasn't, again, a deal breaker for me. It was just something which I always notice. Again, more of a me thing, I think, but it's worth mentioning. If nothing else, for those who perhaps like me are used to driving larger vehicles, maybe you drive trucks for example, maybe you drive a bus, maybe you drive a larger vehicle for work or whatever the case may be, jumping between that and this, you will probably notice that slightly twitchy, slightly more loose handling, especially at higher speeds. Now to go back to my girlfriend Kiasha's thoughts for a second, the main positive thing which she felt was, as I said, exactly the same as me, and that was the fuel economy. It was very, very good on fuel. The other things which she kind of noted as not being so great, and I love getting her thoughts on this because I tend to approach it from more of the mechanical or the car, pure driving experience point of view, whereas she approaches it more from the kind of use inside the car. car, the passenger perspective, but also stuff like the radio, the aircon, that kind of thing. She found that the aircon was quite noisy. It was effective most of the time, but pretty noisy. In her words, it sounded like it was going to combust. Again, that could be a symptom of it being a higher car. The mileage wasn't overly high on it. It was only, I believe, something like a 20,000-30,000 kilometer vehicle. But still, to have the aircon working that hard, well, in South Africa, where you really need the aircon, not necessarily the best of signs, but again, it's hard to say if that's just with this car or if that's a thing in general. I guess you'd have to find that out for yourself by test driving one. She personally found the volume control on the touchscreen to be just a little bit too fiddly, and although it didn't bother me at the time, in retrospect, I think I kind of agree, because the volume control, as we've seen before on, I believe, at least one of the other cars that we hired, it has a tap up or down, the plus or minus on the volume, and of course you can mute it, etc. It really would be better with just a dedicated volume control switch, just a circular knob that you can turn it up or down physically. On the steering wheel, it does have volume control, but her pet peeve was that as the passenger, she couldn't do that, because most of the time she would put on whatever radio station or song she wanted, but then the volume control was very fiddly, constantly tapping or really holding it down for a long time to see that kind of volume change. And if you suddenly get a call come through and it's not connected to the car, it can take a while tapping those buttons to get it to go quiet enough to hear your call, especially if the aircon's on as well. So that's something that's definitely notable. We already mentioned one of her personal issues, and definitely one for me as well. This does seem to be kind of a CVT thing in general though, and that is that it's quite noisy from the gearbox. Some reviewers I've seen have said that they quite like the sound of the engine. I guess I might agree if I could actually hear the engine most of the time, because the gearbox is very noisy when you give it any kind of work. When you really put your foot down on the throttle, which of course is a relative term, it's not like it's the quickest thing around anyway, but when you do, there's much more noise from the transmission than there is from the engine. Could have been this example, but with that kind of mileage, I wouldn't have thought so. It didn't really feel like a car that had been thrashed necessarily, so I don't think it was a case of mistreatment. It's just kind of a CVT thing, I think. Many of this market's automatics seem to have automatics that aren't necessarily the best, so it's not like it's a Toyota Starlet thing. It seems to be just a thing in general with the automatics that are built or manufactured or at least sold here in South Africa. And again, to put it in her words rather than mine, she described, to go back again to the issue with the wheel bearing, or what seemed to be a wheel bearing, and perhaps some suspension stiffness in general, because overall we would both say it was a comfortable enough car. At least she didn't notice the ride, which is always a good sign, but she said that there was a rough road feel, which she described as being kind of like in a Flintstones car, where you feel like your feet are actually on the ground running. Now, I personally didn't feel that on my side, but of course with my feet on the pedals rather than the floor pan, then I wouldn't feel as much of that. But also, it would make sense if the wheel bearing, for example, was the issue on that front left side. That's exactly why she would be feeling that kind of road feedback again. So I wanted to mention that, but I don't feel like that's a fair criticism against all of the Starlets. I do feel like that was probably just this particular car. Ultimately though, that is it for our thoughts between the two of us. I love bringing in her thoughts as well, because she brings more of the kind of real world perspective on the smaller fiddly stuff, like how it feels or sounds or using the radio, whereas for me it tends to be the broad strokes of like economy, how powerful the engine is, the space, etc. of the car, and of course how it drives. Ultimately, if you choose to buy one new or close to new, you will have to make the choice between if you want the better dealer network from Toyota but pay slightly more for it, or if you want to save money on the Suzuki, perhaps support that slightly smaller brand in terms of their South African presence, and maybe have a car which is a little bit more different. Because here in South Africa, of course, owning a vehicle which you see everywhere isn't necessarily always a good thing, especially when it comes to security on the vehicle. So having the Suzuki could be a slight protection there. I don't have any numbers to corroborate that. It certainly wouldn't hurt, I wouldn't imagine, to have a car that is less stealable, considering that the security is the same but it's less of an obvious car to take. That could be something to weigh up as well. On the used market, as I mentioned earlier on, that does change though, with the Toyota being far easier to find in terms of your options, colours, how many there are on the market, etc. But also it would seem many of them being cheaper as well. Of course, mileage will play a factor, but for the sake of a 20,000-30,000 rand difference at their entry point, it is a difference to note between the Suzuki and the Toyota. Obviously, there's more than just those two to choose from. You have the more obvious Volkswagen Polo, etc. options, which are definitely worth weighing in on, and I'm hoping that maybe one of the times that we visit, perhaps later this year, then maybe at some point I'll end up having a Polo. The Polo is the one which I really do want to review, but we never seem to end up getting that one, so hopefully at some point point we will. If of course you are new to the channel and haven't checked out my review for the Nissan Magnite or the Corolla Quest, two other very common cars in South Africa, ones which overall I would say were probably a better, nicer, rounded experience than this car, but again you do have to bear in mind the price point of this being entry-level, super affordable, dependable motoring, pretty much the definition of a car really, gets you from A to B, then of course you have to judge it differently. And of course if you own one of these, or maybe you've driven one or had one in the past, I'd love to hear your thoughts down below, positive or maybe negative. But until next time, I'll see you then, and for now, thanks for watching.